When James Cooper bid $6 on the starving wild horse, the crowd didn't just laugh. They booed him out of the auction arena like he was a fool who'd lost his mind. What happened 4 months later would make every single one of them beg for his forgiveness. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust hung thick in the air that scorching July afternoon at the Riverside County Livestock Auction, swirling in golden clouds whenever the wind picked up from the desert beyond. The auction yard was packed with buyers, ranchers in pressed shirts and polished boots, wealthy collectors looking for their next prized possession, and curious onlookers drawn by the promise of seeing rare Mustangs brought in from the wild. The wooden bleachers creaked under the weight of hundreds of people, their conversations creating a constant buzz of anticipation and excitement. Everyone had come for one reason. The legendary wild horses from the Canyon Ridge Territory were finally being auctioned off after years of federal land disputes. Among the crowd sat a man who seemed almost invisible, despite occupying the same space as everyone else. James Cooper, at 68 years old, wore faded jeans that had seen better days, a flannel shirt with frayed cuffs, and boots so worn the leather had cracked in places like dried riverbeds. His weathered face told stories of decades spent under the sun. Deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth like canyons carved by time. A simple baseball cap shadowed his features, and on his left shoulder, barely visible beneath his shirt collar, peeked the edge of a tattoo. Those who bothered to look closely might have recognized the insignia of the Marine Corps. But few people gave James a second glance. He sat alone in the upper section of the bleachers, away from the clusters of animated bidders who gestured wildly and spoke in loud voices about bloodlines, training potential, and resale values. James held a small foam cup of lukewarm coffee, his calloused hands steady despite the tremor that occasionally visited them these days, a souvenir from his years of service. He watched the proceedings with quiet intensity, his gray eyes tracking each horse as they were led into the auction ring. Some pranced nervously, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Others moved with the confidence of animals who knew their worth. But James was waiting for something different. He was waiting for the one everyone else had already written off. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Duke Morrison, who had been calling bids for 30 years, worked the crowd with practiced enthusiasm. His voice boomed through the speakers, rising and falling in that distinctive rhythm that turned numbers into music. He celebrated each successful sale with genuine excitement, banging his gavel with flourish as expensive horses went for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. The crowd cheered, applauded, and congratulated the winners. Money flowed freely, and spirits ran high. This was the event of the season, and everyone wanted to be part of it. Then came lot number 47. The mood shifted instantly. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, but not one of excitement. It was the sound of disappointment, of wasted time, of an interruption to the main event. Into the ring stumbled a horse that barely resembled the magnificent creatures that had preceded it. The Mustang was a dark bay, almost black, but whatever beauty the color might have held was obscured by the animal's condition. Ribs showed through dull, matted coat. The mane hung in tangles and the tail was caked with burrs and mud, but it was the eyes that told the real story. Wild, fearful, and filled with a distrust so deep it seemed to radiate from the animal like heat from sun-baked stone. The horse moved erratically, pulling against the lead rope held by two handlers who struggled to maintain control. Its hooves clattered against the metal gates, and it tossed its head violently, nostrils flaring. This was not a horse that had been gentled or prepared for sale. This was pure, unbroken wilderness, and it wanted nothing to do with the humans surrounding it. The animal had been found alone in a remote canyon, separated from its herd, half-starved and defensive. The Bureau of Land Management had captured it 3 weeks earlier, but despite their efforts, the Mustang remained entirely untouchable. Duke Morrison's enthusiasm dimmed considerably as he looked at the paperwork in his hand. He cleared his throat and his voice took on a more businesslike tone, stripped of the showmanship he had displayed all afternoon. "All right, folks, Lot 47 here is a wild Mustang, approximately 6 years old, gelding, captured from the Canyon Ridge territory. Now I'll be honest with you, this one's gonna need significant work. He hasn't taken to handling, and he's gonna require an experienced hand." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "Let's start the bidding at $500. Silence. Not a hand moved. Not a voice called out. People shifted in their seats, some turning to their neighbors to whisper comments that carried just far enough for those around them to hear. Waste of time. Should have left that one in the canyon. Not worth the feed it would take to keep it alive. The horse continued to fight against the handlers, and with each passing second of silence, the tension in the ring grew. Duke tried again, his voice losing another layer of enthusiasm. "Come on now, someone's got to want to give this animal a chance. How about 250? More silence. A few people actually laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of dismissive chuckling that said they thought the whole situation was absurd. $100? Duke's voice was almost pleading now. "Folks, this is a federally protected Mustang. Someone needs to take responsibility here." Still nothing. The handlers were having increasing difficulty controlling the panicked animal. One of them looked up at Duke and shook his head, suggesting they move on. Duke was about to bring down his gavel and mark the lot as unsold when a voice came from the upper bleachers. It was quiet but clear, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. $6. Every head in the auction yard turned toward the upper bleachers. The murmurs stopped abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before it erupted into something else entirely. Laughter. Not polite chuckling this time, but full-throated, mocking laughter that rolled through the crowd like a wave. People pointed up at James, elbowing their neighbors and shaking their heads in disbelief. $6. The man had bid $6 on a horse that had been opened at $500. James remained seated, his hand still raised, his expression unchanged. He did not smile. He did not look embarrassed. He simply waited, his gray eyes fixed on Duke Morrison, who stood in the ring looking as bewildered as everyone else. The auctioneer brought his hand up to shield his eyes from the sun as he tried to get a better look at the bidder who had just made what had to be the lowest offer in the history of the Riverside County livestock auction. "Sir, did you say $6? Duke's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he thought perhaps he had misheard. The microphone crackled slightly, and the speakers seemed to amplify the absurdity of the question. Behind him, the wild Mustang continued its frantic dance, pulling so hard against the lead rope that one of the handlers nearly lost his footing. "Yes, sir, $6, James replied, his voice steady and clear, despite not having a microphone. There was no hesitation in his words, no indication that he understood how ridiculous his bid must have sounded to everyone present. He spoke with the same calm certainty he might have used to order coffee at a diner. The laughter grew louder. A man in a white Stetson hat 3 rows down from James turned completely around in his seat, his face red with amusement. $6? Boy, you can't even buy a decent meal for $6, let alone a horse. His comment sparked another round of laughter and a few scattered applause from those who found the whole situation entertaining. A woman in designer jeans and expensive sunglasses leaned over to her companion and said, in a voice that carried further than she probably intended, "Is this some kind of joke? Is he trying to insult the auction?" Her companion shrugged and smirked, adding, "Maybe he thinks it's a garage sale." From another section, a younger man called out, "Hey, old-timer, you know that thing's gonna cost you more than $6 just to feed it for a day, right?" This observation was met with nods and agreements from the surrounding crowd. Several people turned to each other, making calculations and commenting on how impractical, how foolish, how utterly senseless it was for anyone to take on an animal like this, especially for such an insulting price. Duke Morrison stood in the center of the ring, caught between his duty as auctioneer and the bizarre situation unfolding before him. He had conducted thousands of auctions, seen every kind of buyer from the serious professional to the impulsive amateur, but this was new territory. He looked at his assistant, a younger man named Ray who managed the paperwork, and Ray just shrugged helplessly. "Folks," Duke said, trying to regain some semblance of control over the proceedings, "I appreciate the bid, but perhaps we should talk about a more, shall we say, appropriate offer for an animal of this," he gestured at the struggling horse, "particular circumstance." But before James could respond, the booing started. It began with just a few voices, scattered throughout the crowd, but quickly gained momentum. The sound swelled, a chorus of disapproval that had less to do with James personally and more to do with what his bid represented. To the serious buyers, it was an insult to the integrity of the auction. To the wealthy collectors, it diminished the value of their own purchases. To the casual observers, it was simply too absurd to take seriously. "This is ridiculous," someone shouted from the front row. "We came here for a real auction, not a comedy show." Others joined in, their voices blending into a wall of criticism. "Get him out of here. This is wasting everyone's time. $6 is an insult." Through it all, James remained seated, his hand still raised, his face showing nothing of what he might be feeling inside. His jaw was set, not in defiance exactly, but in the kind of quiet determination that comes from having faced far worse than the disapproval of strangers. He had been booed by louder crowds, judged by harsher critics, dismissed by people who mattered far more than these. None of it had changed his mind then, and none of it would change his mind now. Duke Morrison raised his own hands, trying to calm the crowd. All right, let's settle down here." He turned back to James, and for just a moment their eyes met across the distance of the auction yard. In that brief connection, something passed between them. Duke saw something in the old man's face that gave him pause. Perhaps it was the steadiness of his gaze, or maybe it was something else entirely, but the auctioneer made a decision. "Sir," Duke called up to James, his voice cutting through the noise, "you understand this animal is wild, untrained, and in poor condition? You understand what you're taking on here?" "I do," James replied simply. Duke nodded slowly. He looked around at the crowd, at the hundreds of faces waiting to see what he would do next. He looked at the horse, still fighting against its handlers with every ounce of strength in its malnourished body. He looked back at James, sitting alone in the upper bleachers with his $6 and his unshakable resolve. The auctioneer took a deep breath. "Going once at $6, Duke said, his voice lacking its usual flourish but carrying a strange sort of gravity. The booing intensified. "Going twice at $6. People stood up, some preparing to leave in disgust. Duke raised his gavel, held it suspended in the air for a long moment while the crowd's displeasure reached a crescendo, and then brought it down with a sharp crack that cut through all the noise. "Sold to bidder number 117 for $6. The crack of the gavel seemed to echo longer than it should have, hanging in the air like thunder after lightning. For a moment, the crowd was too stunned to react. Then the chaos erupted all at once. People jumped to their feet, shouting protests and objections. Some called Duke Morrison's judgment into question, while others directed their anger at James himself. The atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to genuine hostility, as if the $6 sale had somehow personally offended every person present. James rose slowly from his seat, his knees protesting slightly as they always did after sitting too long. He made his way down the bleacher steps with careful deliberation, one hand on the railing, ignoring the stares and comments that followed him like a shadow. A middle-aged man in an expensive Western suit deliberately stepped into his path as he reached the bottom. "You just made a fool of yourself, old man," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "That animal's gonna kill you or cost you everything you've got trying to fix it. Probably both." James met his eyes briefly, nodded once as if acknowledging the concern, and simply stepped around him. He had learned long ago that some arguments were not worth having, that some people were determined to be right no matter what anyone else said or did. His silence seemed to infuriate the man more than any response could have, and he heard the muttered curses following him as he continued toward the auction office. The walk across the dusty yard felt longer than it should have. Every step brought him past clusters of people who made no effort to hide their opinions. "Waste of $6, one woman said to her husband, loud enough for James to hear. "That horse should have been put down, not sold." A group of younger ranchers actually blocked his path briefly, forcing him to stop. The tallest one, a man probably in his 30s with the swagger of someone who had never truly struggled, looked down at James with barely concealed disdain. "You a horse trainer?" the young man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. James shook his head. "You got a lot of money to burn on a lost cause?" Again, James shook his head. The young rancher laughed and turned to his friends. "Then you're either crazy or stupid, old man. Maybe both." They moved aside, still laughing, and James continued on his way. At the auction office, a small building with peeling paint and a struggling air conditioner, Ray the assistant was waiting with the paperwork. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as James approached. "Look, mister," Ray began, his voice apologetic. "I gotta tell you, Duke bent the rules pretty far, letting that bid stand. Normally we got minimums for situations like this. If you want to back out, I'm sure we could work something out. No one would blame you." James pulled 6 crumpled dollar bills from his wallet and placed them on the counter with steady hands. "I don't want to back out," he said quietly. "What do I need to sign?" Ray stared at the money for a long moment, then sighed and pushed a stack of forms across the counter. As James worked through the paperwork, carefully reading each line despite his tired eyes, Ray watched him with growing curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Ray ventured after a few minutes of silence. James looked up and Ray continued, "Why $6? Why not just bid the minimum if you wanted the horse? Why make yourself look—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence diplomatically. James set down the pen and looked at Ray with those calm gray eyes that had seen far more than most people could imagine. $6 was all I had in my wallet, he said simply. It was what I could offer. The honest simplicity of the answer left Ray speechless. He had expected defiance or pride, maybe even madness, but this plain statement of fact was somehow more powerful than any of those would have been. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. James completed the paperwork, tucked his copy into his shirt pocket, and headed toward the holding pens where his purchase waited. The horse had been moved to a small enclosure away from the main auction area, and even from a distance James could hear the commotion it was causing. The animal was throwing itself against the fence rails, wild-eyed and desperate, while 2 frustrated handlers tried to figure out how to load it into a trailer. When James approached, one of the handlers, a burly man with a sun-weathered face and arms like tree trunks, looked up with visible relief. "You the one who bought this devil?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Good luck, buddy. We can't get within 10 feet of him. Been trying for the last 20 minutes. You got a trailer?" James shook his head. "You got any equipment at all? Halter? Lead rope? Anything?" Another shake of the head. The handler's relief transformed back into frustration. "Then how exactly do you plan on getting him out of here? We can't just open the gate and let him run down the highway." The second handler, younger and nursing what looked like a fresh bruise on his arm, added with obvious bitterness, "This thing's dangerous. Caught me with his hooves when I tried to get close. You ask me? You threw away $6. James moved closer to the fence, slow and deliberate in his movements. The Mustang, cornered in the pen, watched him approach with that same wild terror in its eyes that James had seen from the bleachers. The animal's sides heaved with each breath, its coat dark with sweat and fear. Foam had formed at the corners of its mouth, and its ears were pinned flat against its head. This was an animal that had been pushed far beyond its limits, trapped in a nightmare it could not understand or escape. The handlers watched with skeptical interest as James simply stood at the fence, making no move to enter the pen or reach for the horse. He just stood there, his hands resting lightly on the top rail, his presence calm and unhurried. Minutes passed. The Mustang continued its agitated movements, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, its attention fixed on this new human who was not shouting, not advancing, not threatening. "What's he doing?" The younger handler whispered to his companion. The older man shrugged. "Beats me, but at least he's not getting himself killed." They stood back, content to let this play out however it would, grateful for the break from their own failed attempts. The sun continued its descent, and still James stood at the fence. He did not move toward the gate. He did not call out to the horse or make clicking sounds with his tongue like the handlers had done. He simply existed in that space, a quiet presence that asked nothing and demanded nothing. The Mustang, exhausted from its panic and the day's events, began to slow its frantic pacing. Its eyes never left James, watching for any sign of threat, any indication that this human would prove to be like all the others. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The handlers had given up watching and retreated to the shade of a nearby building, occasionally glancing over to see if anything had changed. Other auction-goers passed by, some pausing to watch the scene with curiosity or amusement. A few made comments. "Still trying to catch your $6 mistake," one man called out, laughing. James did not respond, did not even acknowledge the remark. His focus remained entirely on the horse. It was nearly an hour before James made his first real move. Slowly, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that comes from understanding trauma, he opened the gate. The sound of the metal latch clicking made the Mustang's head shoot up, ears forward, every muscle tensed for flight or fight. But James did not step inside. He simply opened the gate wide, creating an exit, and then stepped back. He moved away from the opening, giving the horse a clear path out if it chose to take it. The Mustang stared at the open gate, then back at James, confusion evident in its eyes. This was unexpected. Every human it had encountered since its capture had tried to corner it, rope it, control it. None had offered freedom. The horse took a tentative step toward the opening, then stopped. It looked at James again, trying to understand the trap that must surely be there. But James had moved even further away, settling himself on an overturned water trough about 20 feet from the gate, his posture relaxed and non-threatening. The handlers noticed the open gate and came running back. "What are you doing?" the older one shouted. "You can't just let it loose. This is a controlled facility." But before they could reach the pen, James held up one hand in a gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and a request for patience. Something in that gesture made them stop. They stood uncertain, ready to intervene if necessary, but curious enough to wait. The Mustang moved closer to the gate, one careful step at a time. Its nostrils flared, testing the air for danger. The open space beyond the gate beckoned, promising escape from the confined terror of the pen. But the horse did not bolt. Instead, it paused at the threshold, its gaze returning again and again to James. In the animal's eyes, suspicion warred with something else. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the faintest beginning of recognition that this human might be different. James sat perfectly still on his makeshift seat, his breathing slow and even. He understood what the handlers did not, what the crowd at the auction could never have grasped. This horse did not need to be caught. It needed to choose. It needed to reclaim some fragment of agency in a world that had stripped everything from it. The Mustang had been torn from its freedom, its family, its entire understanding of the world. Every human hand had brought only fear and pain. Trust would not be commanded or coerced. It could only be offered and accepted. Minutes ticked by. The sun painted long shadows across the dusty ground. The Mustang stood in the gateway between captivity and the illusion of freedom, between the known terror and the unknown possibility. Then, in a moment that seemed to hold its breath, the horse made its decision. Instead of running through the gate and away, it took a step toward James. Just one step, but it was everything. The handlers watched in stunned silence. The younger one whispered, "Did you see that? It's moving toward him." The older handler nodded slowly, his weathered face showing respect for the first time since James had arrived. "I've been doing this for 20 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like it." James remained motionless as the Mustang took another step, then another. The horse's movements were stiff, ready to flee at the slightest provocation, but something was pulling it forward. Perhaps it was the complete absence of threat in James's demeanor. Perhaps it was exhaustion finally overcoming fear, or perhaps in some way that defied explanation. The horse sensed in this quiet man a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be broken by circumstances and still somehow remain standing. When the Mustang was about 15 feet away, James finally moved. It was the smallest of movements, hardly noticeable to anyone watching from a distance. He extended his hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, and let it rest on his knee. He did not reach toward the horse. He did not call out. He simply offered his hand, letting the animal decide what to do with that offering. The Mustang stopped, its whole body quivering with tension. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the horse stretched out its neck, extending its muzzle toward James's hand. The distance between them was still too great for contact, but the gesture was clear. The animal was reaching back. In the world of horses, this was conversation. This was the beginning of dialogue. James spoke then for the first time since opening the gate. His voice was low and soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried across the space between them. "I know," he said simply. "I know what they did to you. I know you're scared. I know you've got no reason to trust me or anyone else." The Mustang's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, still wary but listening. "But I'm not here to break you. I'm not here to make you into something you're not. I'm just here to give you a chance. Same chance someone once gave me." The words hung in the air between man and horse, laden with meaning that went deeper than the handlers could understand. James had not told anyone at the auction about the demons he carried, about the nights when sleep would not come, and the mornings when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. He had not mentioned the 3 tours that had left scars both visible and hidden, or the years afterward when he had drifted through life like a ghost. He had not explained that he saw something of himself in that wild, terrified animal, something that called to the parts of him that still remembered what it felt like to be trapped with no way out. The standoff continued as the sky deepened from orange to purple, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening canvas above. The Mustang had not come closer, but neither had it fled. It stood there, suspended between 2 possibilities, while James remained on his overturned trough, hand extended, patience seemingly infinite. The handlers had long since given up trying to understand what was happening. They simply watched, witnesses to something that defied their professional experience. It was the older handler who finally broke the silence. "Mister," he called out gently, not wanting to spook the horse, "it's getting dark. The auction's closing down. We need to know what you're planning to do here. You can't stay all night." James nodded in acknowledgement, but did not look away from the Mustang. "I'll need to borrow a lead rope," he said quietly, "and I'll need directions to wherever they keep seized trailers." The younger handler looked confused. "Seized trailers? What are you talking about?" James finally turned his head slightly toward them. "The auction office told me there's a lot behind the main building where they keep trailers and equipment that's been abandoned or seized. Said I could borrow what I needed if I returned it in decent condition." The older handler's eyes widened slightly. "You've got no way to transport this horse, so you're planning to borrow an abandoned trailer, and then what? Walk him into it?" "Something like that," James replied. His attention returned to the Mustang, which had been watching the exchange with intense focus, as if trying to understand the human sounds and what they might mean for its immediate future. The horse had relaxed slightly during the conversation, perhaps sensing that the raised voices were not directed at it, were not threats, but simply communication between the humans. Ray from the auction office appeared then, carrying a worn leather-led rope and a halter that had seen better days. "Duke said to give you these," he explained, approaching carefully so as not to disturb the delicate balance between James and the horse. "He also said you're either the bravest man he's ever met or the craziest, and he's not sure which." Ray set the equipment down on the ground about halfway between James and the gate, then retreated quickly. James looked at the halter and rope lying in the dust, then back at the Mustang. The horse had tensed again at Ray's appearance and departure, its eyes tracking every movement. James knew that trying to approach with the halter right now would shatter whatever fragile connection they had begun to build. Instead, he did something that made the handlers shake their heads in disbelief. He stood up slowly, walked past the halter without touching it, and moved toward the far side of the pen where a second gate led to the back lot. "What's he doing now?" the younger handler whispered. His companion shrugged, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his weathered eyes. "I think he's showing the horse he doesn't need the halter. He's letting it choose." They watched as James opened the second gate, the one that led toward the area where the trailers were kept. Then he walked through it, leaving both gates open, creating a path. James did not look back to see if the horse was following. He simply walked with that same steady, unhurried pace toward the trailer lot, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Behind him, the Mustang stood frozen in confusion. This human had opened its cage, had created a way out, and was now walking away. Every instinct screamed at the horse to run in the opposite direction, to put as much distance as possible between itself and all humans. But something held it there. The handlers watched in amazement as, after several long moments, the Mustang took a tentative step through the gate, then another. The horse's head was high, ears swiveling in all directions, monitoring for threats. But its eyes remained fixed on the figure of James walking away in the gathering dusk. The animal followed, maintaining a distance of about 30 feet, ready to bolt at any second but choosing not to. "I don't believe it," the younger handler breathed. "It's actually following him." The older man was already pulling out his phone, opening the camera. "Nobody's going to believe this if we don't get it on video." They followed at a safe distance, documenting what was unfolding before them, knowing they were witnessing something rare and precious. James led the way to the trailer lot, a fenced area containing perhaps a dozen trailers in various states of repair. Some were rusted hulks that would never haul anything again. Others were serviceable but showing their age. James examined several before selecting a 2-horse straight-load trailer that, while old, appeared structurally sound. The tires were inflated, the floor seemed solid, and the door opened without too much resistance. He opened both the side door and the back ramp, creating maximum visibility through the trailer. Then he walked through it himself, demonstrating that it was safe, that nothing lurked inside to harm or trap. The Mustang, which had followed him all the way to the lot, now stood about 20 feet from the trailer, nostrils flaring as it tested the air, trying to understand this strange metal box. James emerged from the trailer and, for the first time, walked directly toward the horse. The Mustang's muscles bunched, ready to flee, but James stopped well outside what he judged to be the animal's flight distance. He sat down on the ground, cross-legged, making himself smaller, less threatening. The action was so unexpected that the horse actually took a step closer, curiosity temporarily overriding fear. From his seated position, James began to talk. His voice was low and steady, not really expecting the horse to understand the words, but knowing that tone and intention carried across species barriers. "I had a sergeant once," he said, "back when I was young and angry and didn't know how to handle what I'd seen. He found me one night sitting outside the barracks, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Everyone else had given up on me. Said I was broken, said I'd never be right again." The Mustang's ears were forward now, focused entirely on James's voice. The horse took another small step closer. "That sergeant, he didn't try to fix me. Didn't give me orders or tell me to pull myself together. He just sat with me. Night after night he'd come out and sit. Sometimes he'd talk, sometimes he wouldn't, but he was there. And slowly, bit by bit, I started to believe that maybe I wasn't as broken as everyone said. Maybe I just needed someone to be patient enough to let me heal in my own time." The stars were fully visible now, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds thrown by an invisible hand. The auction grounds had emptied, most people having loaded their purchases and headed home hours ago. Only the handlers remained, watching from their respectful distance, and the security guard who had been told about the situation and agreed to give James until midnight to resolve it. The night air had cooled considerably, bringing relief from the day's heat, but also a chill that made James glad for his flannel shirt. The Mustang had moved closer during James's story, now standing perhaps 10 feet away, close enough that James could see the reflection of stars in its dark eyes. The horse's breathing had slowed, the rigid tension in its muscles gradually easing. It was still afraid, still ready to run, but the immediacy of panic had faded into something more manageable, a wariness rather than outright terror. James continued talking, his voice a steady thread in the darkness. That sergeant's name was Mike Patterson. He'd seen 3 tours before mine, had his own demons to wrestle with. But he understood something that took me years to fully grasp. Healing isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about learning to carry it without letting it destroy you. It's about finding someone who sees you at your worst and doesn't walk away. He paused, looking directly at the horse. "You've had a bad run, friend. Captured, caged, hauled around by strangers who didn't understand you. But that doesn't have to be the end of your story." The Mustang took another step forward, then another. It was close enough now that James could have reached out and touched it if he'd extended his arm, but he kept his hands resting lightly on his knees, non-threatening, patient. The horse lowered its head slightly, bringing its nose closer to James's level, breathing in his scent. James could feel the warm breath on his face, could see the individual whiskers around the horse's muzzle, the small scars that marked its hide from encounters with barbed wire or rough terrain or the violence of capture. "I'm going to give you a name," James said softly. "If that's all right with you, can't just keep calling you horse or Mustang. You're more than that." He thought for a moment, considering the animal before him. The darkness of its coat, the wildness still evident in its eyes, the resilience that had kept it alive despite everything. "Phoenix," he said finally. "That's what I'll call you, because that's what you're going to be, rising from the ashes of what they tried to make you." The horse, Phoenix now, stretched its neck further, bringing its muzzle within inches of James's shoulder. The man remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then, in a gesture that made the watching handlers gasp, Phoenix touched his nose to James's shoulder, just briefly, before pulling back. It was the lightest of contacts, over in a second, but it represented a breakthrough that James understood with perfect clarity. The horse had initiated touch. It had chosen connection over flight. James slowly raised one hand, moving with glacial patience. Phoenix's eyes widened, and the horse shifted its weight backward, but did not flee. James brought his hand to rest on his own chest, over his heart. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, each word weighted with sincerity. "I swear on everything I have, on everything I am, I will never raise my hand to you in anger. I will never force you to be something you're not. All I'm asking is that you give me a chance. Give us both a chance." Minutes passed. Phoenix watched James's hand resting over his heart, watched his face in the starlight, perhaps reading in those weathered features some map of shared suffering. Then, making a decision that would change both their lives, the horse took the final steps forward and stood directly beside James, close enough that James could feel the warmth radiating from its body, close enough that, if he wanted, he could touch. But James did not immediately reach out. Instead, he slowly stood up, moving with careful deliberation to avoid startling Phoenix. The horse tensed but held its ground. James turned and began walking toward the trailer, and without any prompting, Phoenix followed. The distance between them had shrunk to perhaps 5 feet. They moved together through the darkness, man and horse, two beings who had both known captivity and fear, both searching for redemption. At the trailer, James stopped and turned to face Phoenix. The horse stopped too, looking at the metal structure with obvious suspicion. James walked up the ramp himself, his boots echoing on the rubber matting. He moved through the trailer and out the side door, demonstrating the path, showing that it was not a trap but a passage. Then he did it again, this time slower, talking the whole way. "I know it looks scary. I know everything right now looks scary. But sometimes the only way forward is through the scary thing. Sometimes you have to trust that the path that looks dangerous is actually the one that leads home." He stood at the bottom of the ramp, one hand resting lightly on the side of the trailer. "I'm not going to make you. If you can't do it tonight, we'll try again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, however long it takes." Phoenix stood at the base of the ramp, every line of its body expressing conflict. The trailer represented everything the horse had learned to fear: confinement, loss of control, transportation to unknown horrors. But standing beside the trailer was this human who had asked nothing, demanded nothing, who had offered only patience and understanding. The handlers watched, barely breathing, as Phoenix placed one hoof on the ramp. The sound of the hoof striking the metal was sharp in the night air. Phoenix froze, ready to bolt. But James had not moved, had not reacted with excitement, or tried to capitalize on the progress. He simply waited. The horse shifted its weight, testing the ramp. Then, in a rush of decision, Phoenix scrambled up and into the trailer, hooves clattering, breathing hard, but inside. James moved slowly to close the back, his hand steady despite the emotion flooding through him. He secured the latch and walked to the side door where Phoenix stood, wild-eyed but not panicking. "Good," James said simply. "You did good, Phoenix. We're going home now." The drive home took over an hour, James's old pickup truck pulling the borrowed trailer through dark country roads that wound between fields and scattered homesteads. The truck was a 1998 Ford, more rust than paint in places, with nearly 300,000 miles on the odometer. It burned oil and the air conditioning had stopped working years ago, but the engine was still strong, and James knew every quirk and sound it made. The radio didn't work either, so the only sounds were the rumble of the engine, the whisper of tires on asphalt, and occasionally the sound of Phoenix shifting in the trailer behind. James drove carefully, taking turns slowly and avoiding sudden stops. He talked occasionally, his voice carrying through the open truck window to the horse behind. "Not much further now. Place isn't fancy, but it's quiet. You'll have space to breathe, to figure things out. No pressure, no schedules, just time. He wasn't sure if Phoenix could hear him over the road noise, but it seemed important to maintain that connection, to keep that thread of communication alive. The property James called home was 12 acres of scrubland on the outskirts of town, far enough from neighbors that the silence was almost complete. He'd bought it 8 years ago with his disability pension and the small inheritance from his mother, one of the few good decisions he'd made in the fog of those early years after leaving the service. The land was mostly unusable, too rocky and dry for crops, but it had a small house, a barn that leaned slightly to the left but was structurally sound, and miles of empty space in every direction. As he pulled up the long gravel driveway, his headlights swept across the property, illuminating the modest single-story house with its faded blue paint and sagging porch. The barn stood about 50 yards away, and beyond it, the pasture stretched into darkness. James had strung wire fencing around about 3 acres of it years ago, creating a paddock that had mostly stood empty. He'd kept a few chickens once, had considered getting a goat, but life had a way of staying complicated, and those plans had faded. He parked near the barn and sat for a moment in the cab of the truck, his hands still on the steering wheel. The full weight of what he'd done was settling over him now. He had $6 to his name, having spent his last cash on Phoenix. His disability check wouldn't come for another week. He had some feed left over from the chickens, but it wouldn't be nearly enough for a horse. He had no veterinary connections, no training experience, no idea really what he was doing. But when he climbed out of the truck and walked back to the trailer, when he heard Phoenix shift inside and saw the gleam of those dark eyes through the slats, all the practical concerns seemed to recede. This was no longer about money or resources or even reason. This was about two survivors recognizing something essential in each other, about a connection that transcended logic. James opened the trailer door slowly, stepping back to give Phoenix space. The horse emerged cautiously, placing each hoof carefully on the ramp, testing this new reality. When all 4 feet were on solid ground, Phoenix stood still, head high, nostrils flaring as it took in the sense of this strange new place. The night air carried the smell of sage and dust, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of wind through scrub brush. "Welcome home," James said quietly. He made no move to touch Phoenix or guide the horse. Instead, he walked toward the paddock gate, opening it wide. Phoenix followed at a distance, that same 20 feet or so that felt safe, manageable. When James had the gate open, he stepped aside and gestured to the dark space beyond. Phoenix hesitated only briefly before walking through into the paddock. James closed the gate and watched as Phoenix immediately moved to the far corner, putting maximum distance between himself and the human. The horse stood there, a shadow among shadows, and James could feel the tension still radiating from the animal. It would take time. Maybe a lot of time, but they had that now. He made his way to the barn and pulled out the last bag of chicken feed, perhaps 20 pounds of cracked corn and grain. It wasn't ideal horse food, but it was something. He poured it into a rubber trough and carried it to the paddock, setting it just inside the fence line before backing away. Water was easier. He had a large stock tank that he filled from the hose, and he placed it near the feed. Phoenix watched every movement, still pressed against the far fence, but James noticed the horse's ears were forward, interested rather than terrified. Inside his house, James made himself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, eating at the small kitchen table while looking out the window toward the paddock. He could barely make out Phoenix's shape in the darkness, but knowing the horse was there brought an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time in longer than he could remember, James felt like he had a purpose beyond simply existing from one day to the next. Before bed, he made one final check on Phoenix. The horse had moved from the far corner and stood near the water tank, though it shied away when James approached the fence. The feed trough was untouched, but that was to be expected. Trust didn't appear overnight, and neither did appetite in a traumatized animal. James spoke softly into the darkness. "Tomorrow we'll start figuring this out together. Tonight, you just rest. Nobody's going to hurt you here. You have my word." He returned to the house, to his bedroom with its sparse furnishings and the nightstand that held his medications for sleep and anxiety. Tonight, though, he found he didn't need them. For the first time in years, James Cooper fell asleep quickly, his dreams free of the usual nightmares, replaced instead by images of open spaces and a black horse running free under endless sky. The next morning arrived with the pale light of dawn filtering through thin curtains. James woke early as he always did, but instead of the usual dread that accompanied consciousness, he felt something different: anticipation. He dressed quickly and headed outside, stopping on the porch to survey his property in the morning light. It looked exactly as it had yesterday, humble and weathered and far from impressive. But somehow it felt different now. It felt like it had possibility. Phoenix stood in the same corner of the paddock where James had last seen him, but the horse's posture had changed slightly. The rigid tension had eased just a fraction, and when James approached the fence, Phoenix watched him, but did not immediately retreat. The feed had been touched, James noticed. Not eaten completely, but disturbed, which meant the horse had at least investigated it during the night. The days that followed established a rhythm that became sacred to both man and horse. James would wake with the sun, make his coffee, and spend the first hour of each day simply sitting on the porch where Phoenix could see him. He never approached, he never demanded. He simply existed in the horse's world as a constant, predictable presence. Some mornings he read from an old paperback western he'd found in a thrift store. Other mornings he just watched the sky change colors and listened to the world wake up around them. Phoenix began to anticipate these morning sessions. The horse would emerge from whatever corner it had claimed for the night and drift gradually closer to the fence line nearest the porch. The distance shrank incrementally over the weeks. 40 feet became 35. 35 became 30. It was progress measured in inches and moments, but to James, each small advancement felt like a victory worth celebrating. The practical challenges of keeping Phoenix fed became James's primary concern. With no money until his disability check arrived, he had to get creative. He approached Martinez Feed and Supply on the edge of town, a family-owned business run by Carlos Martinez, a man in his 50s who had served in the First Gulf War. James explained his situation honestly, holding nothing back. He'd bought a rescue horse with his last $6, had no feed, and needed help. Carlos listened without judgment, his weathered face neutral. When James finished, Carlos studied him for a long moment. "The horse you bought at the auction," Carlos said finally, "that's the one everyone was laughing about?" James nodded. Carlos walked to the back of his store and returned with a 50-pound bag of basic horse feed. "You can have this. Pay me when you can." "Pay me when?" When James tried to thank him, Carlos held up a hand. "I know what it's like to feel like you're barely holding on. Just take care of that animal, and we'll call it even for now." That act of kindness was the first of several. Word spread through the small community about the veteran and his $6 horse. Some people continued to mock the situation, making jokes at the diner or the hardware store about foolish old men and their lost causes. But others, particularly those who had served or who understood struggle in more intimate ways, began to help. A retired veterinarian named Dr. Helen Shaw stopped by unannounced one afternoon, offering to do a basic health check on Phoenix free of charge. She approached the paddock with professional competence, and though Phoenix would not let her get close enough for a thorough examination, she was able to observe from a distance. "He's malnourished, obviously," she told James, watching Phoenix through binoculars from the porch. "Probably has parasites. Hooves need attention, but structurally he looks sound. Good bone structure. Once you get some weight on him and gain his trust, he could be a fine horse." She left behind basic supplements and her phone number, telling James to call if he ever needed advice. The transformation in Phoenix was gradual but undeniable. With regular feeding and the absence of stress, the horse began to fill out. The prominent ribs became less visible. The dull coat started to show hints of shine. More importantly, the wildness in Phoenix's eyes began to shift into something else. Not tameness exactly, but a kind of cautious openness, a willingness to consider the possibility that not all humans meant harm. By the end of the first month, Phoenix would eat while James stood at the fence. By week 6, the horse would approach within 10 feet if James had food. By week 8, Phoenix allowed James into the paddock, though the horse maintained careful distance, always monitoring escape routes. James never pushed, never tried to close that gap faster than Phoenix was willing to allow. James fell into the habit of talking to Phoenix during their time together, sharing stories from his past that he'd never told anyone. He talked about his childhood in rural Pennsylvania, about his decision to enlist at 18, about the friends he'd made and lost during his tours. He spoke about the sergeant who had saved him, about the long road back from the edge of despair, about the years of therapy and medication and fighting just to feel normal again. Phoenix listened, ears forward, those intelligent eyes never leaving James's face. Sometimes James wondered if the horse understood more than he gave him credit for. There seemed to be something almost human in the way Phoenix responded to the tone and emotion in James's voice, coming closer when the stories were sad, maintaining distance when James's voice carried the weight of darker memories. The second month brought new challenges. A storm rolled through, heavy rain that turned the paddock into mud and sent Phoenix into a panic. The thunder reminded the horse of something, some trauma from its past, and for 3 days it refused to eat or come near the fence. James spent those nights sleeping on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, so Phoenix could see he wasn't alone. When the storm passed and the horse finally calmed, it walked directly to where James sat exhausted on the porch steps and stood there just out of reach for over an hour. By month 3, something remarkable began to happen. Phoenix started initiating contact. The horse would approach the fence when James was working on other parts of the property, as if checking on him. When James sat on the porch in the evenings, Phoenix would graze nearby rather than in the far corners. One afternoon, as James was reinforcing part of the fence, Phoenix walked up behind him and gently nuzzled his shoulder before trotting away, as if it had been daring itself to do something brave. James documented these moments in a small notebook he kept on the kitchen counter, not because he thought anyone would care, but because they felt important enough to remember. Each entry was simple. Day 47. Phoenix ate from bucket while I stood 5 feet away. Day 63, storm, horse panicked, stayed on porch. Day 81, Phoenix touched my shoulder, first voluntary contact. The transformation was not just in Phoenix. James found himself sleeping better, eating more regularly, taking care of his property in ways he hadn't bothered with for years. The medications he'd relied on for so long sat unused in their bottles. His hands, which had trembled for years, grew steadier with each passing week. It was as if saving Phoenix had somehow saved him too, had given him a reason to believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. 4 months after the auction, James received a phone call from Duke Morrison. The auctioneer's voice was warm and genuinely curious. "James, I've been hearing things around town. People saying you actually managed to do something with that wild horse. I was wondering if you'd be willing to bring him by the auction this Saturday. We're having a special event, showcasing rescue horses and their success stories. I think folks would be real interested to see how Phoenix is doing." James hesitated. The idea of returning to the place where he'd been mocked and booed held no appeal. But Duke continued, his voice earnest. "Look, I'll level with you. A lot of people said some unkind things that day, including me if I'm being honest. I thought you were making a mistake, thought that horse was too far gone. I'd like the chance to show people they were wrong. And more than that, I think it might help other folks see that animals we write off as hopeless sometimes just need the right person to believe in them. After a long pause, James agreed. That Saturday morning, he spent extra time grooming Phoenix. The horse's coat, now glossy and healthy, shone almost blue-black in the sunlight. The ribs that had once jutted prominently were hidden beneath sleek muscle. Phoenix's eyes, once wild with fear, now held a calm intelligence. The horse stood patiently as James worked, occasionally turning to nuzzle his shoulder, a gesture that had become routine between them. Loading Phoenix into the trailer was effortless. The horse walked up the ramp without hesitation, trusting James completely. As they drove toward the auction grounds, James felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He wasn't sure what kind of reception they would receive, wasn't sure he could handle more mockery if it came. But when he glanced in his rearview mirror at the trailer behind him, something settled inside. Whatever happened, he and Phoenix had each other. That was enough. The auction grounds were busy when they arrived, dozens of horses and their handlers preparing for the showcase. James pulled into a spot near the main arena and slowly unloaded Phoenix. The moment they emerged from the trailer, people began to notice. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. A crowd began to gather, drawn by curiosity and disbelief. The Mustang that stepped off that trailer bore no resemblance to the terrified, skeletal creature from 4 months earlier. Phoenix moved with confidence and grace, head carried proudly, responding to James's subtle cues with the trust of an animal that had found its person. The transformation was so complete that many in the gathering crowd initially didn't believe it was the same horse. "That can't be the $6 horse," someone whispered loudly enough for James to hear. "That's a completely different animal." But others who had been present that day recognized Phoenix despite the changes, and the whispers grew into murmurs of amazement. Duke Morrison pushed through the crowd, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "James," he said, extending his hand. "I'll be damned. That's really him." James nodded, shaking Duke's hand. The auctioneer walked slowly around Phoenix, taking in every detail. "This is remarkable. This is absolutely remarkable. How did you do it?" "Patience," James said simply, "and time, and believing he was worth saving." His words carried across the crowd, and several people had the grace to look ashamed. These were some of the same faces that had laughed and booed 4 months earlier. The wealthy collector in the white Stetson stood toward the back, his expression unreadable. The woman who had suggested James was insulting the auction stood with her arms crossed, staring at Phoenix with something like wonder. The young rancher who had called James crazy and stupid approached slowly, his earlier swagger gone. "Sir," he said, his voice uncertain, "I owe you an apology. I said some things that day, called you names, told you that horse was a waste. I was wrong. Dead wrong." He looked at Phoenix with genuine admiration. "What you've done here, it's nothing short of incredible." Others began to come forward one by one to apologize. Some did so verbally, their words stumbling and awkward but sincere. Others simply approached with respect in their eyes, asking if they could get closer to Phoenix, marveling at his condition and temperament. The horse, for his part, handled the attention with remarkable composure, staying close to James but showing none of the terror that had defined him months earlier. The woman who had spoken cruelly at the auction stepped forward, tears visible on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said to James. "I laughed at you. I thought you were foolish, but you saw something in that horse that none of us could see. You had faith when the rest of us had only judgment." She reached out hesitantly toward Phoenix, and when James nodded his permission, she gently touched the horse's neck. "He's beautiful. You've given him a life, a real life." Duke Morrison called for attention, and the crowd quieted. "Folks," What we're seeing here is more than just a rescued horse. This is a lesson for all of us. 4 months ago, we all saw an animal that was broken, used up, not worth our time or money. Every single one of us wrote him off. Every one of us except James Cooper. He gestured toward James and Phoenix. James saw past the fear and the malnutrition and the trauma. He saw potential, he saw worth, and he was willing to invest everything he had, even when everything he had was just $6 and a lot of heart. The crowd was silent now, hanging on Duke's words. How many other animals do we dismiss because they don't meet our standards? How many people do we write off because they're struggling or different or damaged? Maybe the real measure of our character isn't how we treat the strong and the beautiful. Maybe it's how we treat the ones everyone else has given up on. The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping, then building into something thunderous. People who had booed James 4 months earlier now stood and applauded, tears streaming down many faces as they recognized not just their error in judgment, but something deeper about compassion and redemption. James stood quietly, one hand resting on Phoenix's neck, overwhelmed by the moment but grounded by the solid presence of the horse beside him. After the showcase ended, dozens of people lingered, wanting to talk with James, to hear more about the journey he and Phoenix had taken together. Carlos Martinez from the feed store appeared with his teenage daughter, who immediately fell in love with Phoenix. "Dad told me what you did," she said to James, "but seeing it is completely different. Can I take a picture with him?" James nodded, and the girl stood beside Phoenix, beaming while her father captured the moment. Dr. Helen Shaw arrived as the crowd was beginning to thin, her professional eye immediately assessing Phoenix. "The transformation is remarkable," she said, running practiced hands along the horse's body with James's permission. Phoenix stood calmly, accepting her examination. "You've done everything right. His weight is perfect, coat is healthy, hooves are in excellent condition, but more than that, look at his eyes. That's a horse that feels safe. That's a horse that knows he's loved." As the afternoon wore on, James noticed a young couple standing at a distance, watching Phoenix with particular intensity. They approached hesitantly, and the woman spoke first. "Mr. Cooper, my name is Sarah Chen, and this is my husband David. We run a rescue organization about an hour north of here, specifically for horses seized from abuse situations or slated for slaughter. We've been doing this for 5 years, and we're always looking for foster homes, people willing to take on difficult cases." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What you've done with Phoenix, it's exactly what we need more of. Would you ever consider fostering other horses?" James looked at Phoenix, who stood quietly beside him, then back at Sarah and David. The idea had never occurred to him. He'd taken on Phoenix out of necessity and recognition, seeing something of himself in the broken animal. But the thought of doing it again, of offering that same patient redemption to other desperate creatures, felt right in a way he couldn't fully articulate. "I'd need to think about it," he said honestly. "Phoenix needed a lot of time and attention. I'm not sure I could manage multiple horses." "We wouldn't expect you to take on more than you can handle," David assured him. "But even one horse at a time, giving them the space and patience to heal like you gave Phoenix, that would be invaluable. Most people want quick results. They want a horse they can ride or show within weeks. But some horses need what Phoenix needed: time, understanding. Someone who won't give up when progress is slow." Sarah handed James a business card. "Think about it. There's no pressure. But if you ever feel ready, we have horses that need exactly what you have to offer." They thanked him and moved on, leaving James to consider a future he'd never imagined for himself. As the sun began to set and the auction grounds emptied, Duke Morrison approached one final time. In his hands, he carried a check. "James, the showcase had a fundraising component. We raised money for horse rescues throughout the county. The board met just now and decided unanimously that a portion should go to you, to help with Phoenix's ongoing care and to support any future rescues you might take on. He handed the check to James, who looked at the amount and felt his throat tighten. $5,000. "Duke, I can't accept this," James started, but the auctioneer held up his hand. "You can and you will. You've shown this community something we needed to see. You've reminded us what's important. Consider it an investment in the kind of compassion we should all be showing." Duke's voice grew thick with emotion. "That day 4 months ago, I nearly refused to let your bid stand. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the auction, but you taught me that integrity isn't about money or rules. It's about seeing value where others see waste. It's about having the courage to act when everyone else walks away." James loaded Phoenix into the trailer as the last light faded from the sky. The drive home was quiet, peaceful, and James found himself reflecting on the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 months ago, he'd been a man barely holding himself together, existing rather than living, haunted by memories and regrets. Phoenix had been a terrified, broken animal with no future beyond probable euthanasia. Back at the property, as James unloaded Phoenix and watched the horse trot freely into the paddock, head high and confident, he felt something shift completely inside himself. For years, he'd believed his best days were behind him, that his service and his struggles had used up whatever potential he'd once had. But standing there in the darkness, watching Phoenix roll in the dust with pure joy, James understood that redemption had come not despite their brokenness, but because of it. 2 damaged souls had found each other in the least likely of circumstances. A $6 bid that the world had mocked had become the foundation for something precious and rare. James had saved Phoenix, yes, but in doing so, the horse had saved him right back. They had given each other the most valuable gift anyone can offer, a reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, that healing is possible, that love and patience can overcome even the deepest wounds. As James settled onto his porch that night, Phoenix came to the fence nearest the house and stood there silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The horse made a low, contented sound, and James smiled. "We did good, didn't we, friend?" he said softly into the night. "We did real good." In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, and Phoenix's ears swiveled toward the sound, but the horse did not spook or flee. He simply stood there, secure in the knowledge that he was home, that he was safe, that he was exactly where he belonged. And on the porch, an old veteran with a weathered face and a heart full of gratitude felt exactly the same way. The story of the $6 horse spread far beyond the auction grounds, beyond the small town, becoming something larger than either James or Phoenix could have imagined. It became a reminder that value isn't determined by price tags or first impressions, that the things we dismiss as worthless often hold the greatest treasures, and that sometimes the act of saving another is the very thing that saves ourselves. In the end, James Cooper and Phoenix proved that $6 and a whole lot of heart could change 2 lives forever, and in doing so, inspire countless others to see the world through more compassionate eyes.